Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's FS Club webinar on privacy-enhancing technologies and their potential. The session is going to be led by Rob Leslie, who's the founder and CEO of Sedici. My name is Robert Pay, and I'm an associate of ZN, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair this event today. But I can only do so thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, many and diverse, who allow us to range freely and widely across technology, economics, and finance. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and hand over to Rob, but first a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, the slides are available for download in the chat and on the FS Club website. We'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after David's presentation, so please make sure to use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send in your questions, and I'll feed them into the dialogue later on. If we don't get through all the questions, then Rob has basically undertaken to deal with those later on. So, over the next 20 minutes, Rob's going to unpack for us why he believes that confidential collaborative computing is the next major development in computer services. Over to you, Rob.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert, and good morning, everybody. Very much looking forward to introducing this topic to you because I've been working on it now for a number of years, and it really is exciting me as to what its potential actually is. So just to kick it off, it would probably be really useful just to give you a very quick context setting as to where privacy has come from. Some of you will recognize this date, the 6th of June 2013. It is the anniversary of the D-Day landings, but there was something more impactful in the world of privacy that happened on this date. Probably most of you won't recognize it, but you will recognize this gentleman. This is Edward Snowden. And the 6th of June 2013 was the day Edward Snowden announced to the world the PRISM program that the US government was using to surveil essentially everybody in the United States. And by extension, everybody else in the world started to wonder, well, what are they doing in relation to me and my personal data? It was probably the first time that people started to become aware of the power of data and the need for control around how your personal information was to be used. Now, some very smart people realized that data had real utility and real value. If you click the next slide, please, Morgan. This gentleman managed to get himself elected in the United States. And as we have all seen, he very cleverly managed to find some very clever data scientists and an organization that had a lot of data and managed to combine both of them by putting them together. Next slide, please. Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. And for the first time, what we were able to see really was the power of information when used really cleverly in order to generate an outcome. In this case, getting yourself elected to be president of the United States. It was almost around the same time that GDPR was being promoted in the European Union as a control over how organizations could use or potentially misuse information. So we had seen over a very short space of time an evolution from a world where essentially anything goes in relation to data to one where strict controls were starting to be put in place. And we're now at the situation where I recently read a report that by 2023, 65% of all of the countries in the world will have enacted some form of privacy law or regulation in order to control how information is used. And this will be transformational in terms of what you can do and what you can't do with data. Now, this creates a challenge. How do you process information if you are required to keep it in discrete silos? And this is where privacy enhancing technologies come in. Next slide, please. So what are they? They're essentially a set of cryptographic techniques and protocols that allow organizations and individuals to collaborate on data that has some form of confidentiality or sensitivity associated to it, in a manner where you don't have to trust the parties who are contributing it. In other words, we can work on our data, but we're not exposing the raw data to each other, but we're able to extract the value that we would like to get out of it. Next slide, please. Very quickly, there are 7 different categories that I'm just going to rattle through here very quickly so that you're aware of them, just touching on what they are. Homomorphic encryption, essentially a mechanism where data is encrypted, and rather than processing the data in unencrypted form, you process it while it stays encrypted. Then the secure multiparty computation, another cryptographic process that allows multiple organizations to contribute inputs to a computation in a manner where none of the individual contributors learn what the others are providing. So the information that you provide stays completely private to you, and the information that anyone else provides stays private to them. Differential privacy, a mechanism where the privacy of an individual or an organization whose data is being contributed to a statistical analysis of some kind is preserved in some way. Zero knowledge proofs, we've seen a resurgence of zero knowledge proofs. They've been around for 30 years, but they're used in the cryptocurrency world in order to be able to prove something again without necessarily sharing the underlying information. I can prove to you that I know something without declaring to you what that is. Synthetic data, I suppose the name explains it. It's an artificial data set that mimics the properties of a genuine data set, so that you are able to work on it as if it was the real thing, but it's not. Names and addresses potentially have been anonymized in some way, but you still are able to extract value from the data because it mimics very closely what the genuine data set looks like. Federated learning, a mechanism where algorithms essentially are shared between parties. So rather than the historic way of processing something where you would aggregate all the data into a centralized location, in this case, the algorithm moves between the parties, picking up whatever it needs to do at each point as it moves around. And then the last one is trusted execution environments. This is a hardware solution where inside a microprocessor, there is a dedicated area specifically allocated for processing sensitive data. It's completely partitioned from all of the other activities within the processor. So what problems do PET solve? Essentially, it allows us to process information that is sensitive without sharing it with third parties. So we're able to extract information from it in a collaborative way without necessarily having to share that information. And if you start to think about applications like healthcare, financial services, law enforcement, cybersecurity, where there is an inherent requirement to share information, but legal restrictions around the ability to do that. So you could have, for example, in healthcare, a hospital, a doctor's surgery, a pharmacy, a life insurance company, who all have pieces of your health record. They're not allowed to share them with anybody. But using a privacy enhancing technology, you could set up a mechanism where they could test to see, is somebody allergic to a particular drug, for example, being able to access all of the information across those 4 different contributors without exposing that information to anybody else. Next slide, please. So what opportunities do PETs create? The opportunity here is enormous when you think about how much data exists in the world today. And rather than just looking at our own information, if we were able to combine that with information that other parties hold that could be of interest to me, I might be able to extract more value from that. We think there are a ton of use cases that are going to come, very readily to life as these technologies become real and more prevalent in the community. Next slide, please. I read a very interesting white paper recently, and the references on the bottom was from a venture capital company called Lunar Ventures. And in it, they had these statistics, which actually just blew my mind. Today, McKinsey estimates that we touch only 1% of all the data that is out there. And we extract about 10% of 11.5 trillion. So just over $1 trillion worth of value is extracted already using that 1% of data. They estimate that using the combination of the privacy enhancing technologies that I've just introduced to you, we'll be able to extract at least another 1% of value from the data over the next 10 or 20 years, and generate another $1 to $2 trillion of new value that comes to life because of the ability to collaborate that previously didn't exist. Now, when you think about financial services, insurance, healthcare, education, all of the places, intellectual property, all of the places where more collaboration could do huge amount of positive things for the economy of the world, this is a really useful thing to start thinking about. Next slide, please. So what benefits do pets offer? Well, the main goal or benefit that we get is we're able to process information in a manner where the confidentiality of the data is preserved. In other words, I'm able to do things with data that isn't mine and extract some value from it. So there's a real and tangible value that can be generated without compromising confidentiality. And I'm going to try and bring this to life for you with an example in a minute or two, just explaining how the technology could be deployed in a real world scenario, showing how value can be extracted to solve a real problem that we actually have. Next slide, please. However, it's not all rosy in the garden. There are inefficiencies that arise because of the use of privacy enhancing technologies. And here are 5 of them. Computational overhead. When you are processing data that is encrypted and keeping it encrypted, for example, in the case of homomorphic encryption, there is a very heavy computational burden on that. And that can be expensive in terms of energy costs, computational power that you need in order to do it. Communication overhead in the case of zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computations. Because the parties are exchanging what I loosely describe as messages, those messages need to be transferred, and there can be a lot of them. Again, there's cost involved in that transfer, and therefore, it can be inefficient and expensive. Network latency, because of the computational overhead, the communication overhead, again, processing can take time. Integration of complexity, engineering complexity, you may need expertise to help you build the processes, the architectures, in order to do that. And then one that is not technical at all, which is legal and governance. What we're talking about here is the creation of collaborations. And collaborations require legal and trust frameworks in order to govern how the relationships between the parties will operate. And making sure that the rules of the game, so to speak, have been laid down and that everybody is playing to the same standard, essentially. A critical part of this is because you're relying on data that's coming from other parties to know that you can trust the data in some way. So what we end up with in a sort of perfect world where privacy enhancing technologies are working really well is the ability for corporations who now have their data sitting in corporate clouds to be able to build these collaborations really easily with each other without the need to aggregate that information into centralized repositories. One of the things that we think is going to be really important is entity resolution, which ultimately resolves back to identity. And this is where digital identity comes into the picture. And it's not just individuals, but it's corporations, it's devices, it's everything essentially. Can I accurately identify who I think I'm talking about in each of the different data clouds that I'm accessing? So we think this is very, very important in the grand scheme of things. And this is where digital identity, I think, is going to plug into the next generation of cloud. Next slide, please. So we'll do one poll, and we have another poll coming up towards the end. So based on what I've given you, the question I'm asking is, would your business or your customers benefit from the use of privacy-enhancing technologies? 5 choices for you: very significantly, significantly, somewhat, not so much, or not at all. We'll give you a few seconds to make your choice, and then we'll see what the audience thinks.
So while you're all voting, I just thought I'd take the opportunity to remind you to send in questions, as several come in so far. So please add to those.
Super. So here we can see the results of the poll. So significant benefit, or very significant benefit, more than 50%, over 60% would think there would be significant benefit, which I think is indicative overall as to where the market is likely to go. So very interesting result there. Thank you very much for that. Next slide, please. So where we have been focusing as a company are in 2 particular areas: multi-party computation and zero-knowledge proofs. And these are the 2 that I probably know most about. And I just want to highlight one thing that is really important in this, because it has both legal and regulatory impact. And it is an information property that some information has when it comes to pets. It is a thing called information theoretic security. And essentially what it is the means mathematically to be able to prove that there is absolutely no information of any value being exchanged with the other parties involved in your collaboration. So I've just done a comparison here on 4 of the different PETs that exist: trusted execution environments, homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation, and zero-knowledge proofs. Some of them use encryption, and some of them use techniques that are information theoretic secure. And you can see that those that use encryption have a possibility that they could leak information. And what I mean by this is that they use encryption, and encryption essentially is the means of taking a key and converting something into something that is undecipherable. But that can be decrypted at some point. So if you've got enough computational time and power, eventually you will be able to crack the code and get back to what you originally had in terms of the raw piece of information. When something is information theoretic secure, you won't be able to do that because every possibility has the same probability of being correct in simple terms. Next slide, please. And how do you make something information theoretic secure? It uses a cryptographic primitive called Onetime Padding. And essentially what you do is you take a string piece of information and you apply a random number to it using an exclusive OR function, and that generates a random string. I'm not going to get too technical here, but there's a lot of very complicated mathematics going on, and I'm not a cryptographer and I'm not a mathematician. My colleagues would say he knows enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be useful. So that's where I kind of land. But the point I'm trying to leave you with here is that one-time padding, when applied to information, will allow you to make it information theoretic secure, which will satisfy a lot of legal and regulatory compliance challenges. Next slide, please. So let me try and bring this to life for you with an example. And as many of the audience today are involved in financial services of some kind, I decided I was going to pick a fraud, money laundering example. So here we have two banks. There's a payment transaction going from the customer of one bank to the customer of another bank. And today, each bank looks at their customer individually and maybe looks at information that they collect from the public domain in order to assess, fraud or money laundering risk. They're not able to communicate effectively or easily, but if they could, the combination of the information that both of the banks hold might be indicative or helpful to try and identify some kind of illicit activity. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is essentially use a privacy-enhancing technology, and the one I'm going to use is multi-party computation, that essentially would allow the two banks involved in this transaction to build an algorithm and run it against the data that each of the two banks holds in order to try and generate a risk score that the transaction is fraudulent or illicit in some way. And I'm going to do that by looking at the behaviors, the traits, the characteristics associated with each of those accounts in the two different banks. Next slide, please. And those things sort of fall into, I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail, but there's a lot of information that the two banks have that would allow you to build algorithms that would allow you to assess risk for one thing or another. Looking at the KYC record, looking at the transaction activity on the account, and then the login activity. Do I expect this account to do the things that would be normal for a person? I have a British student going to university in the UK. Why am I seeing a lot of login activity from Russia, for example? And that would be unusual and a bit odd. But you could identify that with an algorithm. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is to take these attributes, behaviors and traits from the two different banks and create essentially a risk assessment algorithm that would allow me to ultimately determine whether there's some kind of illicit activity going on here or not, as the case may be, by looking at the information that each of the two banks hold, but not sharing it. That's the key point. The information never moves between the two banks, just the result. Next slide, please. So a simple algorithm that I'm going to look at, and this is a very real world problem, authorized push payment fraud. In the UK, it's about £600 million a year at the moment and growing. And essentially what it is a crook tricking a person into making a payment to their account instead of payment to a legitimate person or vendor who the person would normally be making in the course of business. So a very, very simple algorithm here that I've created is I want to check that the remittance instruction at one bank matches the payee account information at another bank. And then maybe see, are there any other things that are unusual at the payee account or not? And if there is, we'll trigger an alert. If there isn't, we'll execute the payment. No problem whatsoever. Next slide, please. So here we have an example. On the left-hand side, we've got Bank A with its customer, a lady called Ashley Scott. And what she wants to do is to set up a payment to British Telecom at account number 40250872. And there's a couple of other details associated with the account there. In Bank B, on the right-hand side, you can see that the account number 40250872 belongs to a chap called Russell Hunter. It's not British Telecom at all. And the address is also different. So we've got three attributes here that are clearly different. The name is different and the address is different. If each bank was looking at its own data, nothing would appear out of the ordinary. But because the remittance instruction set up with Bank A has information that would allow a match to be confirmed or unconfirmed, we're able to generate an alert that says there are problems with the beneficiary here that we might need to investigate further. So let's have a look and see, are there any other things that we can look at in Bank B that would help us to determine whether there's some kind of illicit activity going on? So we look at other flags that the bank has generated. And in this case, you can see that the third one down has a suspicious activity report been filed for that account within the last year. So this would be information that Bank B would have, and the answer to that is yes. Or has a hold been placed on this account in the last year, with the last one on the list? The answer to that is also yes. That is indicative that there may be something really inappropriate, illegal, or fraudulent going on. And before the money gets remitted from Bank A to Bank B, there may be more investigation required. If you look at Bank A for the same attributes, you can see that the lady who's sending the money, Ashley Scott, she hasn't had anything suspicious. There's been no suspicious activity report filed against her account. There's been no hold placed on her account in the last year. And essentially what we've been able to do here, just to summarize, is build an algorithm that allows the sending bank to confirm certain things with Bank B, the beneficiary bank, without exchanging any of this information. Now, some of this exists today in the UK through the confirmation of payee process. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that using multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, privacy-enhancing technologies generally, you can build a variety of different algorithms that could test for a whole conflagration of different typologies that would identify all kinds of illicit activity. It doesn't have to be two parties. You could have multiple parties involved as well. And you can test for a whole variety of other things other than what we have on this screen. So I hope that brought it to life in some way. Next slide, please. So we're going to do one final poll and just ask you, what do you see as the greatest barrier to the deployment of privacy enhancing technologies within your organization or within your customer base? Is it legal and regulatory uncertainty around data? Is there a lack of technical knowledge and understanding relating to privacy enhancing technologies? Is there an unwillingness to collaborate with others? Is it a cost issue? Or is the overall benefit to the organization insufficient to justify the effort? So if you could all press your button now and choose which one. Give you a couple of seconds to make your choice. Great, so we've got the top, quite an even spread. Cost is absolutely not an issue, which is really good to see. Highest one, lack of technical knowledge and understanding, but close second is legal and regulatory uncertainty around data. So between the top three, we still have well in excess of 70%, probably 80% of those. The one that I'd probably be most concerned about is an unwillingness to collaborate with others. But still, it's less than a quarter of the audience, but still very interesting insight. So thank you all very much for that. The last thing then that I'm going to leave you with before we open it up to questions and answers, just to give you some ideas in terms of possible use cases. So I've given you one around anti-money laundering and fraud in financial services. Insurance is another area where looking at claims fraud between insurance companies. For example, has a claim been filed for the same loss with a different insurance company? Again, you could run algorithms that would allow you to do this. Confidential data analytics, again, building aggregated scoring mechanisms using information from a variety of different organizations in order to generate some kind of an analytical output. Could be very useful for regulators in order to get real-time information, essentially, from organizations that they're regulating. Credit reporting, again, traditionally credit reports involve the aggregation of information. What if you could leave that information in situ and run the same algorithms against it and give you real-time credit scoring using the data providers and their data where it sits. Protection of cryptographic keys. So by breaking a cryptographic key into multiple parts, you could store it in different places and then use homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation to recombine that key as and when the owner of that key decides. Now, these are just 4, 5, 6 suggestions. There are thousands of possible applications for these technologies, which is why we think the potential is global in nature and really enormous. So I hope that was useful. very happy to open it up now and to take some questions. So back to you, Robert.
Thanks very much indeed. Fascinating presentation. And in fact, we've got a number of questions here for you. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the last poll, they sort of fall into two categories. One, essentially governance and regulatory, and the second, technical. So I'm going to start with, there's two people, Jeremy Wilson and Edwina Moreton, who both sent in the questions about the threat of quantum computing to this emergent technology. And I'm wondering if you've got anything to say about that threat, which causes a threat to all sorts of technologies that are currently in use.
So this is a really good question, and comes back to the point I was making about information theoretic security. So quantum computing essentially is the ability to massively process or use computing power to attempt to decrypt information. So it will have an impact on those technologies that use encryption at their core. If you're using a technology that is information theoretic secure, one of the key properties is that with multi-party computation, for example, or zero-knowledge proofs, even with unlimited computing power and unlimited time, you will not be able to get back to the original piece of information. And that means it is quantum secure. Because even with a quantum computer, you will not be able to extract the raw data from what it is you were trying to do. So that limits the options that are available to you. I think if quantum computing is of concern. However, the computational overhead, for example, in terms of what you want to do, may not be appropriate right now. So it's I would say horses for courses, but bearing in mind it's all about risk at the end of the day. So determining, what your risk is in the context of what you're trying to do will be one of those factors that you build into your decision making as to what technology you decide to use in the end. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. A question now from Richard Sage, who was very pleased to see that you addressed the challenges as well as the benefits of the new technology. But he's wondering if there's one other challenge, which is the risk of mistakes in the logic of the integration and engineering complexity and privacy being breached. It's one thing to trust the technique, he says, but it's even a good technique can be implemented badly.
Absolutely correct. At the end of the day, the data that you produce is only as good as the algorithm that you create. The risk of building bias into your algorithm obviously exists if humans are creating those algorithms, so you've got to be cognizant of that. Equally, bad data. If you're processing against bad data in some way, you're going to end up with a bad result coming out. It's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And so you've got to be very, very careful about that. So absolutely spot on. These are the things that need to be addressed in your governance framework. And we would be very strong about making sure that you have controls of some kind in place in order to ensure that you're able to identify when, biases occur or, inappropriate algorithmic processing, whether it is human or AI driven, to make sure that you're able to identify it when it happens and fix it ultimately.
Great. I've got a question now from Alex Powell, who asks, this technical one here, what is the performance overhead for encrypted laptop hard drives, which presumably are homomorphic and homomorphically encrypted? Thinking about large organizations that might have this distributed to maybe thousands of employees, that maybe is a big consideration.
Again, I'm not an expert in hardware or the amount of processing, so I'd caveat that. Other than the information that I picked up through listening to the experts talk about this is that homomorphic encryption does have a significant computational overhead when it comes to processing information. So you need more power, essentially. How much depends on the complexity of the computation, I would suggest. Less complex algorithms will obviously take less time to execute. But if you've got very complex algorithms, I would suggest that there could be a time limitation.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Dan Feeney that covers sort of technical issues. Without an interoperable, secure, and portable digital identity framework, how can shared data schemes like open banking truly go mainstream? We actually had a talk about open banking last Friday.
Great question. And I think the answer to it is it would be very hard. I think ideally there has to be some form of standards-based approach to this. One of the things, in terms of the use of privacy-enhancing technology that we would strongly advocate is, the participants involved in the collaboration would agree a data taxonomy, for example. What attributes are going to be made available by each party for the others to process against? And without that sort of shared approach to, or agreed approach to structuring your data, or the type of algorithms, for example, that you are going to allow within the collaboration, again, you will end up with a mishmash of things, and probably something that doesn't work very well. So again, this is something we would suggest that you get into the governance framework, again, which needs to be agreed by the parties at the start. And if you've got very clear rules and lines around what data is there, what we will allow to process, how the results get shared, how audit is performed and how regularly, what happens, if somebody is found not to be performing their obligations, whatever, all of these things will come into play ultimately as to the ultimate quality of the solution. And if you get those right, you will extract a lot of value, is what my recommendation would be. So it's worth spending the time at the beginning to do that.
Okay. Now another governance question, and Douglas Andrews is asking, what measures could be taken to prevent platforms like Facebook and Google from using their access to massive amounts of personal data and algorithms to modify consumer and citizen behavior on a massive scale? You think about how when you sign up for Google, which is Gmail or whatever, they have massive amounts of this data, and so does Facebook. And you can see this technology could be used quite easily in the current environment, perhaps for noble or nefarious ends.
Absolutely. The possibilities of the data being used for both good and bad exists. But again, in terms of personal information, while all of the information that Google and Facebook has already collected is still out there, into the future, there'll be a lot of new information that will be generated that just, they may not get. And I think this is where the likes of GDPR and the privacy legislation that many countries are putting in place will come into force, and will, demonstrate real value. That ultimately the consumer has a choice here. Am I happy to allow my information to be processed, for something that I think is of value to me, or not, as the case may be? And it might be that, in the computation, a key flag is, do I have consumer consent to allow this processing to take place? And if that consent is not automatically provided, or is available as, or not available as an attribute, then the processing cannot take place. And in that case, Facebook, Google, whoever is instigating the processing will not have the benefit of the output. So it comes back to, I think, giving a certain amount of control back to the user, to the citizen, to the customer, and letting them understand clearly and transparently what the value is for them. I think this is one of the things that, over the years, people didn't understand what Facebook and Google really were. We were blinded a little bit by all of the free services that they provide, not really understanding that the data was what they were ultimately targeting, and the value that they could extract from that data was what ultimately was going to make their business succeed or fail.
Okay, thank you for that. Yet another governance question, one from Bob McDowell here. How do you address the issue of individual or corporate demise in the context of data privacy? Does privacy automatically lapse? I suspect that's a national legal issue at the moment. And what triggers the lapse of privacy? I can think of experiences I've had where I've seen defunct banks' data used for modeling and training purposes.
So this is a really interesting question. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but again, the work that we've done on corporate entities, this is where I think authoritative sources become really important. Ultimately, oracles, sources of truth that you can go to that will give you the definitive legal position on something. And in this case, Companies House, for example, in terms of the corporate entity, is the authoritative source for that information. So if Companies House says, a company is dead, then it is dead. If the Companies House record says it's still alive, it's still alive. So being able to access that information, and if you could do it in real time, building that into your algorithms, that would allow you to either continue to offer services or, pause offering services if something came back from Companies House that basically said, the record is not as I expected it to be. It's triggered an alert, and until that gets resolved, I can't continue to offer services. So it's not just, bank to bank, but it could be bank to Companies House, or you could start to build in algorithms that have lots of data providers potentially contributing to a computation. So, you can see how rich it could get, provided the ecosystem was there to do it.
It's a rather specific question here from Stephen Murgatroyd, who's saying that, and there's no reason why you should know the answer to this, I think, but the NHS is currently disseminating large amounts of data to third parties. Do you think they're using PETS technology?
In a word, no.
Yeah.
I don't think they are, but it's a really good application for the use of privacy-enhancing technology. There may be, the excuse of it being a national emergency, given the COVID situation, in order for, for them to do what they need to do, which is completely understandable. But, on an ongoing basis, where you might want to build in controls around how that information is shared, disclosed, processed, the use of privacy-enhancing technologies is most definitely a way to build in that control. So I would be a big advocate of it, obviously, and I think it's a really good use case.
Right. Well, anyway, listen, I think we've now got to the end of the session. I still have about 7 or 8 questions I could ask, but we're going to be sending those for you to speak to the people directly. And so as we end, I'd firstly like to thank all the FS Club sponsors, and you see their logos there now. And I'd like to thank the audience for such good questions, which actually are still coming in, and for being so attentive throughout what I thought was a very interesting presentation. I've certainly learned an awful lot. There's a few, in fact, there's 3. Even though it's summer, it's never summer for the FS Club. There are 3 webinars next week, and you can find details of them by going to the website, which I'm sure many of you here are familiar with. And a final thank you to you, Rob, for your talk today. And were this an auditorium, you'd be getting a thundering round of applause, no doubt, but you'll have to make do with people clapping in their apartments and offices around the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.